Welcome to AlexGs Aquarium, everybody. Today I've got another update on the build. I'm happy to announce that the aquarium bottom installation has been completed. I want to take some time to talk about how the aquarium bottom was built for this tank, a bit about why I built the aquarium bottom in this particular way, and finally go into some installation details. It was a big job to get this aquarium bottom installation completed. Took a little longer than I thought it would and hit a few unexpected bumps in the road with just the amount of time that it was going to take to do it. But it's finally done. It looks great. I'm happy with the work. I want to start off by talking about how the aquarium bottom is made, and really it comes down to layers of plywood. I took a few scraps here just to show, to make this a little bit better detail. But the bottom of this tank essentially consists of two layers of 3/4 inch plywood, which I've tongue and groove jointed with a router. I then laminated these sheets together with a staggered joint on top, which essentially makes 1.5 inch thick piece of plywood over the entire top of this tank. This also sits on top of a 3/4 inch sheet of plywood that's the stand top. So in all reality, I have 2.25 inches of plywood between the stand structure of 2x4s and 2x6s and the aquarium bottom. I think it's also important, after reviewing how I built this, is to talk a little bit about why I built it this way. Why did I go with 1.5 inch thick plywood bottom with these joints that are laminated together with two sheets of plywood on top of another sheet of 3/4 inch plywood? And it really goes back to the wealth of knowledge that I've kind of gained over the years in building my own tanks now. I've built several. My 720 gallon and 480 gallon plywood tanks I originally built had this same type of bottom structure going on in terms of thickness. Now I limited those tanks to being the size of a 4x8 sheet of plywood, which is why they were 4 foot by 8 foot tanks. But when I built them, I did have a 3/4 inch sheet of plywood on the top of the stand, and subsequently I had built the tank with just a 3/4 inch bottom. I had some extra plywood though and said, I think I'll go ahead and just add another layer. The tanks worked well, they never had a problem. I'm using the same stand design. I've literally just scaled up the 720 in terms of the same stand design for the most part, with the same type of stand top, and I figured the same type of aquarium bottom would be warranted because it works. And I know this is extremely overbuilt, so it's not going to be a problem for the amount of water that's going into this tank. The one change though I did make was the tongue and groove joints, and that's only because there was no joint together for these pieces of plywood, because my old tanks, it was all right angles because I never exceeded the full sheet size of a piece of plywood. So that's why I decided to go with this, because it has proven itself for years in the past. My tanks I've rebuilt, I've done the same exact thing on the 700 gallon refugium. It's got a triple thick bottom. I have confidence in it, and it's been working once again, which is why I decided to go with this particular method for bottom installation. Installing the aquarium bottom on this tank had a lot of steps, and it started by going out to Home Depot and purchasing the plywood I needed. I bought 18 sheets of 3/4 inch birch plywood, which is 2 sheets short of a whole pallet. I had to rent the truck. I was lucky enough to where they were able to use the forklift at Home Depot because they had a brand new pallet, put it right on the truck, got it home, and then that's when the hard part for me started, because I needed to unload 18 sheets of plywood by myself. I got them up into my dining room. Once I had them there, I started prepping the tank for the sheets of plywood. And the first thing I decided to do was just take down the plywood I needed at the time. So I was just taking 3 sheets down. I'm not getting any younger, and it's one heck of a workout to take those down a flight of stairs that has a landing in the middle by yourself, but I did manage to get it down, so that was the first big part of the job. The next thing that I wanted to do was get my tongue and groove joints made. Now, I decided to use my plunge router. It was the easiest thing to do. I would have preferred to do it outside because it is incredibly messy with a router to cut tongue and groove joints, because you're removing a lot of material with a real high-speed machine. When it came to the tongue and groove joint, it was actually pretty easy to use the router. I only needed one bit that had a 1/4 inch wide joiner on it, and the thing is, I have a plunge router, so in order to make this joint, it took 3 passes of the router, 1 on my groove sheets and 2 passes on the tongue sheets. And you'll see they fit together. They're a little bit loose, and that was done by design. I originally had made these joints pretty tight, but the problem is, 1, glue won't fit in there, and 2, and this is probably the bigger one, is that trying to do a tongue and groove joint that is 7 feet long for the whole width of the tank, when you have plywood that might be slightly warped before it's put down, not so fun. So the first couple that I did, I had them a little bit tighter. I shaved a little more material off as I went on though, and made these joints a little bit looser, just because it made things a lot easier to work on. And I really wasn't worried about there being a gap in there, because anything that's on the first layer is going to get covered with another layer of plywood, and anything on the top layer I could fill in with epoxy and fiberglass, so there's no concerns there. Now, in order to do this properly, I wanted to make sure this first layer of plywood going down on the stand top was not getting glued to it. So what I did is I made all the pieces for the first layer of the aquarium bottom, and when I went to glue the tongue and groove joints together, I put a layer of parchment paper underneath here. And that layer of parchment paper would ensure that I didn't glue this plywood to the stand. I put a handful of fasteners in. On each side, I would put 1 2.5 inch screw into the bottom seal beam, and then in the middle of the sheets I would just do 3 to 5 1.25 screws to just push this plywood down and make sure that any warping in it got weighted down and pushed it flat. I wanted to do that because in the event that I have to move in the future, or for whatever reason disassemble this tank, if I can't get to the plywood stand top to remove all the screws, it will be impossible to take this apart unless I completely cut it apart all the way, which could be done, but I would prefer not to do that. So that is why I decided to do this. I should be able to pull the bottom off of the stand top if needed. Once the first layer of plywood was installed, all the tongue and groove joints were glued together. It was time to start the second layer. Now this was the more challenging and labor intensive layer of plywood that had to go down for a number of reasons. The first one being is that I was not going to use any screws to hold this down. It was going to get laminated to this first sheet with just glue. In this case, I decided to use Titebond 3 wood glue. When I was prepared to install a sheet, there was a multi-step process involved. One, I cut the sheet of plywood to fit the section it was going to. When that was done, I had routed out my tongue and groove for the first sheet and the subsequent 3 sheets. So I had a few sheets ready to go. But this is where things kind of changed up. First, you can't just laminate this down with just glue. You have to have a few things prepared first, and they're very important. This is a finished grade plywood. It's very smooth. It's generally very straight, which is why I went with it, because I didn't want to deal with a lot of difficult warping issues in sheets of plywood, and laminating stuff that's not flat or relatively flat is very difficult and requires a lot more effort. Therefore, with this sheet of plywood, you can't just put the glue down and be done. I would find out where it is, draw a pencil line down here, and then I would flip the sheet over. I'd sand both sides with 80 grit sandpaper. Then I went through and did a cleanup. I would vacuum, I would wipe everything down with a damp cloth, give it some time to dry, and then I used a roller and my glue to apply a thin layer of glue to this first sheet here. And it was a very thin layer of glue. I tried to even it out as best I can and work as quickly as I could. It would take me about 10 minutes max to get this done, which is right around the max set time this glue has to start curing. So you got to move fast. Once that was completed, I would take this sheet and flip it and set it over. Now, on the edges of this, I would use clamps, but in the center of the sheets, I had to use a bunch of ballast weight to push this down. So what I did is I took all the 5-gallon buckets that I had in the house, I filled them all with water, put tops on them, and started setting them on one side of the sheet and working myself over towards the edges. And that would allow me to kind of compress and get any big amounts of excess glue out, which I never had a whole lot. And then the clamps would go around the outer edge. As I did the first sheet of this, I realized there was a slight bow in one of the sheet, and the water on the buckets was not enough, even though I double stacked it, then I triple stacked it. So what I had to do was go and get more ballast weight to put on here. I had several buckets of sand from my old aquarium, which have been sitting in the garage or storage facilities for a year and a half fermenting, which I didn't want the tops to come off on, so I brought those all downstairs and loaded them on top of these sheets. So I had somewhere between 500 and 1,000 pounds of weight. I never figured it out. It's a lot, and I would use that in combination with clamps to hold each sheet down for a minimum of 24 hours. Any of the sheets that had a little bit of extra bowing or warping in them, I made sure they were down for more like 48 hours. And then I'd start pulling off the clamps and the weight slowly to observe what was happening. Overall, the process worked out perfectly. I now have this wonderful 1.5 inch thick bottom, which is the biggest piece of wood that I've ever glued together in my life. Maybe the last, I don't know. But I could say it worked out good. Everything turned out great. It's now on top of the stand, and I'm ready to proceed on to my next steps. A couple things I'll share that were kind of lessons learned here is definitely have more ballast weight if you're going to do sheet laminating on plywood, because it's really necessary, and it likely took several days for the glue to cure. The next thing I would say too is when you're using something like a router in your house, I had the vacuum going at all times, but I did have one little mistake, and that was one of the times I was routing. You get a little bit of smoke off of the wood sometimes when you're starting cuts, and I just happened to be right below the smoke alarm, and because my smoke alarms are all wired together, I set off the whole house at once, and I'll just say my wife did not appreciate that happening, and she thought the house was on fire. So that was something. I removed that smoke detector and just moved it out of the area while I was working with the router. So just a good tip there. I'm really happy to be able to share this with everyone and the progress on this tank. As always, if you have comments or questions on the build, go ahead and leave them down below in the comments section. If you like the video, go ahead and give it a like. I've been doing a lot of content on Instagram and even been doing some Instagram lives as well. So if you want to see more up-to-date stuff, I post pictures every day or two and sometimes hop on live videos. And I just want to say thanks to everybody that's been asking questions and being real supportive of the build. I know there's a lot of people watching it to to see how it turns out and if it's going to work or if it's going to cause a big giant flood down here. In either case, I'm going to have fun building this thing. I can't wait to share more with everybody. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and I'll see you on the next video.